It was direct, stark, deliberate. From the heart of Tehran, before a massive crowd gathered beneath banners of revolution and resistance, Iran's supreme authority delivered a message meant not only for Washington, but for the entire world. If Iran is attacked, the war will not be limited. It will spread. It will become regional. This was not rhetoric designed for applause alone. It was a strategic signal, broadcast at a moment when American warships move closer, when regional airspace fills with surveillance aircraft, and when the Middle East once again finds itself suspended between deterrence and disaster. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Iran has oscillated between hostility and restraint. Threats, sanctions, proxy conflicts, and covert operations have defined the space between them, but rarely has the tension compressed to this degree, with military forces forward deployed and political timelines narrowing by the day. What makes this moment different is not just the scale of the buildup, but the context surrounding it. Inside Iran, the country is still reeling from one of the most violent periods of internal unrest in its modern history. What began as localized economic protests rapidly transformed into nationwide expressions of anger over collapsing currency, chronic mismanagement, environmental crises, and decades of social and political repression. The state responded with force. According to international observers, rights organizations, and foreign-based monitoring groups, the death toll from the crackdown may number in the thousands, possibly far more. Iran's leadership disputes these figures, attributing much of the violence to armed groups and foreign-backed sabotage. The truth, obscured by weeks of internet restrictions and information blackouts, remains contested, but the consequences are unmistakable. A society traumatized, a government under pressure, and an external confrontation threatening to eclipse everything else. Against this backdrop, the Supreme Leader's speech was not simply about foreign enemies, it was about internal control. By framing the unrest as a coordinated coup, by invoking the language of sedition and survival, the state reasserts a familiar narrative. Iran under siege, attacked not only by missiles and sanctions, but by infiltration and manipulation. This narrative serves a dual purpose. It delegitimizes dissent at home while justifying defiance abroad. In Washington, the response has been carefully measured, but unmistakably firm. American officials speak of negotiations, of deals still possible, of doors not yet closed. Yet alongside those words comes an unmistakable show of force. Carrier strike groups repositioned, naval assets deployed, and public declarations that the United States stands ready to act if its conditions are not met. This is pressure diplomacy in its purest form, force visible enough to intimidate, but not yet unleashed. The danger lies in the gap between intention and interpretation. For Iran's leadership, American military movements are not abstract signals. They are reminders of history, of interventions, coups, and wars that reshaped the region. Suspicion is not paranoia in this context. It is institutional memory, and so the warning is issued clearly. Any strike will not remain contained. This is not a threat of immediate retaliation. It is a warning about the architecture of conflict. Iran does not fight wars the way superpowers do. Its doctrine is not centered on decisive battles or overwhelming force. Instead, it is built on dispersion, of capabilities, of alliances, of consequences. A strike on Iran would not be answered in one place at one time. It would echo across the region, activating networks, allies, and asymmetric responses that stretch from land to sea. This is what makes the prospect of war so dangerous, because neither side controls all the variables. Inside Iran's parliament, the mood reflects this hardened posture. Lawmakers don military uniforms, chants fill the chamber, ritualistic, symbolic, defiant. These scenes are meant to project unity and resolve, to show that the political system remains intact and mobilized despite internal fractures. At the same time, the state attempts selective concessions, small signals aimed at easing domestic pressure without surrendering authority. Incremental changes are floated, promises are made, But trust, once broken, is not easily restored. For many Iranians, grief overshadows ideology. Mourning cannot be erased by text messages or official statements, and the memory of violence lingers beneath every display of national unity. This internal fragility shapes external behavior. Leaders under pressure rarely de-escalate easily. Confrontation can become a tool of consolidation, a way to redirect anger outward, to frame survival as patriotism, and to portray dissent as betrayal. Yet this strategy carries immense risk because the external adversary is not a distant abstraction. It is a military power with unmatched reach, watching closely, calculating costs, and weighing whether restraint still serves its interests. The United States, for its part, faces its own contradictions. American leaders speak of protecting human rights, of responding to state violence, of preventing nuclear escalation. But military intervention carries consequences that extend far beyond any single objective. It risks igniting a chain reaction that would engulf allies, disrupt global trade, and redraw security calculations across multiple regions. Energy markets already react to every signal. Insurance premiums rise, shipping routes are reassessed. The world's dependence on stability in narrow waterways becomes painfully visible. And hovering above all of this is the question neither side wants to answer publicly. What happens if deterrence fails? Because once the first strike occurs, once blood is spilled by design rather than accident, the logic of escalation takes over. Leaders lose room to maneuver. Public opinion hardens. Retaliation becomes expectation. This is why warnings matter. They are not just words, they are markers, placed deliberately at the edge of a cliff, signaling how close the fall may be. The Supreme Leader's message was meant to draw that line clearly, cross it, and the conflict expands beyond control. U.S. officials insist that diplomacy remains possible, that talks can still avert conflict, that the deployment of forces is meant to prevent miscalculation, not provoke it. Yet history shows that when weapons are placed forward, timelines accelerate, options narrow, the margin for error shrinks. Every additional ship changes the equation. Every additional statement hardens expectations. For American planners, the central dilemma is credibility. After years of issuing red lines on nuclear enrichment, regional aggression, and internal repression, failure to act now risks undermining deterrence not only with Iran, but with other adversaries watching closely. If threats are not backed by action, future warnings may carry less weight, but action carries its own costs. Military strikes may damage facilities, degrade capabilities, and send a message of resolve, but they do not erase knowledge, ideology, or political will. Iran's nuclear expertise, its regional networks, and its capacity for asymmetric retaliation would survive any limited campaign. This reality haunts strategic planning rooms. Inside Iran, a parallel calculation unfolds, shaped by vulnerability rather than superiority. Iran's leadership understands that it cannot win a conventional war against the United States. Its air force is aging, its navy is asymmetric, its economy is fragile, but Iran does not need to win decisively. It needs only to ensure that the cost of confrontation becomes unacceptable. This is the logic of deterrence by entanglement. Iran's strategy is not to confront American power head-on, but to stretch it, forcing Washington to defend multiple interests across multiple domains at once: maritime security, regional allies, energy infrastructure, cyber systems, political stability in fragile neighboring states. A single U.S. strike could trigger responses far beyond Iran's borders. This is why Iranian officials repeatedly emphasize the regional nature of any war. They are not exaggerating. They are describing design. In this framework, escalation is not a cliff. It is a slope. One step leads to another, and each step becomes harder to reverse. Missile launches invite counterstrikes. Retaliation demands response. Allies invoke commitments. Markets react instantly. And once momentum builds, control slips away. This is why both sides speak simultaneously of readiness and restraint. why threats are paired with offers to negotiate, why war is framed as inevitable, yet endlessly deferred. It is not indecision, it is calculation under uncertainty. Regional actors are not passive observers in this process. They are stakeholders and potential casualties. Gulf states, hosting American bases while sharing geography with Iran, fear becoming battlegrounds in a conflict not of their choosing. Their leaders push quietly for de-escalation, even as they reinforce defenses, publicly neutral, privately alarmed. Israel watches closely, acutely aware that any U.S.-Iran confrontation would intersect with its own security environment. Missile defenses are tested, intelligence sharing intensifies, preparations are made for scenarios that leaders hope never materialize. Turkey, Qatar, and other regional powers attempt mediation, not out of altruism, but self-preservation. They understand that even a limited conflict could destabilize trade routes, refugee flows, and internal politics across the region. Yet mediation faces a brutal reality. Both Washington and Tehran believe time favors them. The United States believes pressure will eventually force concessions, that economic strain, isolation, and military posture will push Iran toward a deal on American terms. Iran believes endurance will outlast pressure, that domestic resilience and regional leverage will wear down U.S. resolve. This asymmetry of expectation is dangerous because when both sides believe they can wait, escalation becomes more likely, not less. Each interprets the other's restraint as weakness. Each assumes the other will blink first. But history suggests blinking is rare when pride and survival are at stake. Domestic politics amplify this risk. In Iran, the leadership frames resistance as national dignity. Compromise under threat risks appearing as surrender, not just to foreign power, but to internal critics. The memory of revolution, war, and isolation has shaped a political culture where defiance is synonymous with legitimacy. In the United States, electoral cycles and public opinion constrain choices. Leaders must appear strong, decisive, and in control. Any perception of appeasement carries political cost. Any military setback would be magnified. These pressures do not encourage nuance. They reward clarity, strength, simplicity. But geopolitics is rarely simple. The most dangerous moments are not when leaders intend war, but when they believe they can manage escalation, when they assume retaliation will be proportional, when they underestimate how quickly events can outrun intentions, signals misread, accidents occur, commanders act on incomplete information, a drone is misidentified, a missile test is misinterpreted, a naval encounter escalates, and suddenly the logic of prevention gives way to the logic of response. This is why the current moment feels so precarious, not because war is certain, but because it is possible in ways that are increasingly difficult to control. Both sides insist they do not seek conflict. Both prepare as if it may come. Both warn of consequences. Both leave the door to diplomacy open while surrounding it with barbed wire. War, in this confrontation, would not arrive with a single declaration or a defining moment. There would be no clear starting gun, no unmistakable first strike announced to the world. Instead, it would begin in fragments, isolated incidents that only later would be understood as the opening moves of something far larger. A radar lock here, a missile launch there, a ship altering course too late. The first hours would be defined by uncertainty. If the United States were to strike Iran, the initial blows would likely be precise, technologically overwhelming, and deliberately limited. Air and missile attacks would target command and control centers, air defenses, missile launch sites, and nuclear-related infrastructure. The objective would not be occupation or regime collapse, but shock, disruption, and deterrence. Yet Iran's military doctrine is built on surviving exactly this kind of assault. Iran has spent decades preparing for a war it assumes it cannot win conventionally. Its strategy does not rely on matching American firepower. It relies on dispersion, redundancy, and retaliation. Facilities are buried, mobile, and decentralized. Missile units are designed to operate independently. Command structures are hardened against decapitation. Even under heavy bombardment, Iran would retain the ability to respond, and that response would not be confined to Iranian territory. Ballistic and cruise missiles could be launched toward regional military bases hosting U.S. forces. Naval units, particularly fast attack craft, could swarm shipping lanes in the Gulf. Mines could be deployed silently, turning the world's most critical energy corridor into a battlefield of uncertainty. Cyber operations would unfold in parallel. Financial systems, energy grids, communications networks, attacks might not be immediately attributed, but their effects would be felt instantly. The Strait of Hormuz would become the epicenter of global anxiety. Roughly one-fifth of the world's traded oil passes through this narrow passage. Even the perception of danger, without a single tanker destroyed, would send prices soaring. Insurance rates would spike. Shipping companies would reroute or halt operations. Markets would react before diplomats could speak. Energy shock would ripple outward. Inflation would rise. Supply chains would tighten. Governments far removed from the Middle East would feel the impact in fuel costs, food prices, and political pressure at home. War, in this scenario, would not stay regional for long, even if the fighting did. Israel would almost certainly be drawn in. Iran has made clear that any U.S. attack would be met with retaliation not only against American assets, but against allies. Missile and drone strikes could target Israeli territory directly or through regional partners. Israel's air defenses, though advanced, are not impenetrable. Even limited strikes could force escalation. A second front would open, whether planned or not. Across the region, armed groups aligned with Iran would face a choice: remain on the sidelines and risk irrelevance, or act and risk annihilation. Some would act independently, others would wait for direction. Not all would coordinate perfectly. Chaos favors escalation. The United States would respond to each new threat with additional force, defensive at first, then increasingly punitive. What begins as a limited operation could expand rapidly, driven by the need to protect personnel, reassure allies, and maintain credibility. This is the trap of escalation dominance. Each side believes it can control the ladder of conflict. Each step up is justified as necessary, proportional, and temporary, but the ladder has no clear top, and climbing down is far harder than climbing up. Civilian populations would bear the cost. In Iran, air defenses positioned near cities would draw fire toward urban areas. Infrastructure damage, power grids, water systems, transportation would compound existing economic hardship. Internet access, already fragile, could collapse entirely. Fear would spread faster than facts. In neighboring states, populations would brace for spillover. Missiles misfire, drones stray, bases near civilian areas become targets. Refugee flows could resume on a scale not seen in years. And yet, despite the intensity, this war might never be officially declared. No invasion, no occupation, no clear end state. Instead, a grinding confrontation defined by periodic strikes, pauses for diplomacy, and renewed violence. A war of signals and countersignals, of messages sent through explosions. The international system would struggle to respond. The United Nations would call for restraint, emergency sessions, and ceasefires. Statements would be issued, draft resolutions vetoed, humanitarian corridors proposed but difficult to enforce. Major powers would maneuver diplomatically, some pushing for de-escalation, others exploiting the crisis to advance their own interests. Arms sales would surge, alliances would be tested, global attention would oscillate between horror and fatigue. And then there is the nuclear question, the one that shadows every calculation. Even if nuclear facilities were struck, Iran's knowledge base would remain. Scientists cannot be bombed out of existence. Expertise cannot be erased. The risk is not that war eliminates the nuclear issue, but that it accelerates it. A leadership under attack may conclude that deterrence failed and that only the ultimate deterrent can guarantee survival. This is the paradox at the heart of military action. Strikes meant to prevent a nuclear outcome could make it more likely, not less. The longer the conflict drags on, the harder it becomes to define victory. What does success look like? Damaged facilities, a return to negotiations, regime behavior altered under fire, and what does failure look like? Prolonged instability, regional collapse, a generation shaped by war? These questions would haunt policymakers even as events outran their answers. Yet war is not inevitable. Even in the midst of fighting, channels would remain open, back channels, intermediaries, urgent messages carried through third parties. Negotiations might resume under fire, shaped by bloodshed rather than trust. History shows that many wars end not because objectives are achieved, but because costs become unbearable.